One of the first things you'll need to do after your athlete is connected to your account is set their thresholds and zones. You may do this immediately after they connect to your account if you already know what their threshold is or the athlete has a good idea, or you may do it in the first few weeks after you've done a test or collected some data. We'll start by reviewing exactly what threshold and zones are, and then we'll move on to how to set those in training peaks. Threshold is a concept from exercise physiology that has several different names depending on the exact protocol used in a lab to determine it. You'll hear names like lactate threshold, onset of blood lactate accumulation, maximal lactate steady state, and several others. While these are all subtly different protocols, the differences are mostly academic. In the real world, people generally use these interchangeably to refer to the same concept. A more practical approach to the concept of threshold for everyday use for most coaches and athletes is the idea of functional threshold, which is based more around field tests and real world performance than around laboratory tests. There are several different ways to think about functional threshold. The first is that it's the maximum sustainable steady intensity that an athlete can hold for a long time, which is about 35 to 75 minutes, depending on the athlete. Another way to think about it is it's a narrow range of intensity, power, pace, or heart rate, below which the athlete could sustain for a much longer time, 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 hours, depending on the athlete. And above that intensity, they would only be able to sustain it briefly, less than 10 or 15 minutes. Functional threshold is one of the endurance sports performance metrics that's the easiest to track and work with. It's arguably the most fundamental metric for determining current aerobic fitness and tracking progress in endurance sports. It's definitely not the only one, but it's probably the one you'll be focusing on the most and then building the others on top of that. It's also the measurable baseline for most zones, intensity prescriptions like structured workouts, and for all of the other training metrics that you'll be using, so it's important to get it dialed in. There are a few general ways to determine threshold that range in accuracy, expense, ease of use, flexibility, and how often you can use them. We mentioned lab tests earlier, which lie on the far end of the higher accuracy but higher expense end of the spectrum. They aren't practical for most age group and amateur coaches and athletes, though you may want to send some athletes to get a lab test every year or so, especially if it's the type of athlete that likes to nerd out on the sports science side of things and feel like they're the center of attention in a lab for an hour or two. Or if you are providing higher end or more advanced customization services, or you need more specific information that you can get from a lab like metabolic profiling. On the other end of the cost versus flexibility end of the spectrum are data estimates, or just estimating threshold from existing race or hard training data. In the middle and the most commonly used ways to determine threshold are field tests, which we'll talk about further. There are a variety of field tests that have been developed for different sport types and different intensity measures like power, heart rate, or pace. And they all generally have one of two approaches. And that's either trying to ride threshold for as long as possible or determining threshold with a shorter test and some kind of correction factor. For example, some field tests that are common for determining bike power threshold are a 20-minute time trial, and then you take the average power from that and multiply it by 95% to correct it out to a duration that's more like what the athlete could sustain for an hour. You could also do a 30-minute time trial. Some coaches just use that result as is for a newer athlete that may not have a lot of endurance, or they'll apply a lesser correction factor. There's a 2x8-minute test where you can take the average of the last 8-minute interval or the average of each of them combined. You can do a straight 60-minute time trial with no correction factor. And a lot of indoor training platforms have a ramp test built in that lets you get a pretty accurate estimate of threshold with a relatively short test, maybe only 30 minutes long, including warm-up. Field tests for swimming pace threshold are generally a little bit more simple since the range of speeds in swimming is so small and it's pretty difficult to measure them accurately. You'll see things like 100-yard or 100-meter time trials, and you can just use that value as the threshold value. There's a 400-yard, 400-meter time trial with a small correction factor. And then there's a critical swim speed test from Swim Smooth that has you do 2 shorter tests and then a simple calculation to determine threshold from that. Field tests for running pace are more similar to cycling tests, but usually a little bit shorter and with smaller correction factors, since most running workouts tend to be a little bit shorter than a similar bike workout for a similar athlete. You have 20-minute and 30-minute time trials. You can use a 2x8-minute time trial off the bike if you want to get a better idea of threshold for a multi-sport athlete. You can use 5 or 10K race times, depending on the most common race duration that athlete competes in. There are critical velocity calculators that you can look up. And then for running power, there is one established protocol that involves taking the average of a 3-minute all-out effort and a 9-minute all-out effort that take part in the same session. Next is threshold heart rate, which you use with athletes that don't have the equipment to measure other types of threshold, like power meters for cycling or GPS watches for running, or as a fallback method if the athlete's equipment fails for a given workout. You'll also end up using it for other sport types that don't have established ways of measuring intensity, like snowshoeing, Nordic skiing, or other types of cross-training. To determine heart rate threshold, you'll look for the stable value from any of the longer field tests, any of them that are longer than about 20 minutes. By stable value, what we mean is that in the first few minutes of any of these tests, the athlete's heart rate will slowly rise over the first few minutes, which can lower the average. Look for where it plateaus and use the average from that. It's important to remember that an athlete's threshold heart rate is likely different between different sport types, like cycling versus running. It's also important to remember that it can be inflated by nerves or excitement on test day or on race day. So if you're ever in doubt, round or estimate down a few beats per minute and then refine it from there going forward. You can configure training peaks to notify you when data uploaded from an athlete suggests that they may have a new threshold. For heart rate and power, this is based on new peak 60-minute values or 95% of new peak 20-minute values. And for running, this is based on new peak 45-minute average pace values. These are pretty useful, but there are other pieces of data that may indicate an athlete has a new threshold, so don't use these as an excuse to stop paying attention. That's just a quick overview of some of the more common field tests for determining threshold. You can find dozens or hundreds more if you search online, but it's important not to get too attached to any one. None are really that much better than any of the others, so just use whichever one is the most practical in any given situation for any given athlete. Next, we'll talk about how to estimate thresholds without a test at all, but just by looking at existing workout and race data. One way to determine threshold from existing data is to look at the power distribution for a single session that has a variety of high-intensity efforts at different durations, like a fast group ride or race. Since it's difficult to sustain intensities above threshold for more than a few minutes, and relatively easy to sustain intensities below threshold for a long time, we'd expect to see much more total time spent below threshold than total time spent above threshold. And when we look at the power distribution for this race simulation group ride, we do see a pretty significant drop-off around 250 or 260 watts. If this is the only piece of information you have about a new athlete, then setting this as their threshold, about 255 watts, will be more than accurate enough to get you through the first few weeks of planning until their first official test. You can also look at the athlete's best results over a range of workouts, like the last 6 weeks or 90 days, using the peak power, peak pace, or peak heart rate chart. In this example, we can see that over the several weeks before the athlete started working with us, their peak 20-minute power was 279 watts. We can multiply that by 95% to get a good starting value for threshold power. For running, you can view peak pace by duration or by distance. Here we can see the athlete's best recent 10K and use that for our threshold pace setting. Determining an athlete's threshold also allows you to establish some general intensity training zones for planning and analysis. We'll do a quick review of zones before moving on how to set thresholds and zones in athlete settings and training peaks. Training zones roughly correspond to metabolic energy production systems. Aerobic or mitochondrial respiration, which uses mostly fat at lower intensities, and then progressively more carbohydrate as you increase intensity. anaerobic glycolysis for higher intensity efforts of several seconds to maybe a minute or two long, and then the phosphagen system, which uses ATP directly for all-out maximal efforts and sprints. You can go more in depth into energy systems in one of our courses dedicated to exercise physiology. Establishing training zone allows you to target specific energy systems in planning or determine how effectively an athlete is training in those zones. Zone 1 for recovery at shorter durations, or for metabolic efficiency and fat metabolism at longer durations. Zones 2 and 3 for general aerobic development and endurance training. Zone 4 corresponds to threshold and the start of anaerobic glycolysis. Zone 5 uses intervals of 2 to 8 minutes in length to target maximum aerobic output and corresponds with VO2 max. Zones above that target maximum sustained anaerobic efforts and shorter sprints that use the phosphagen and neuromuscular systems. This is just a generalization of common zone systems. Other systems exist to better deal with a coach's specific methodology or the discipline an athlete is training for. When you see the relationship between energy systems and zones, it becomes clear the role that threshold plays in determining those zones. Threshold falls in the upper range of aerobic energy production, which is the focus of most endurance training. While this is a single system, broadly speaking, there are subtle changes as the intensity increases, from more fat utilization to more carbohydrate utilization, and progressively into the lower levels of sustainable glycolysis and rising lactate levels. There are never distinct cutoff points for energy production systems. It is always a smooth and overlapping transition. In the aerobic zones, most people experience these transitions at approximately the same intensities as a percentage of threshold. So you can pretty easily define an athlete's zones using a percent of threshold value. The higher intensity anaerobic energy systems and the associated zones aren't as strongly correlated with a specific percentage of threshold, but you can start with the results for those zones from threshold-based calculators and then refine them as you collect more data about a given athlete's anaerobic performance and how they respond to workouts prescribed in those zones. To wrap up most of the key points about threshold and zones, most of the other important training metrics that you'll eventually use, as well as the zones you use for planning and analyzing general training intensity, are all based on an athlete's individual threshold setting. Getting threshold close enough and keeping it updated is far more important than getting it exactly right. You could spend a lot of time chasing unnecessary precision here for very little gain for yourself or your athlete. Since the range of power output is so large in cycling and running, you can even go as far as to always round a threshold value to the nearest 5-watt increment and not worry about updating it unless it is changed by at least that much. There are many, many ways to determine threshold, and they are all equally imperfect. So choose the one that will work best in a given situation, whether that's a field test or just an estimate from day-to-day training data. Don't forget to pay attention to subjective information as well. If an athlete is starting to describe threshold or VO2 max workouts that were previously very difficult as much easier to complete, it may be an indicator that their threshold has improved. Finally, zones calculators are all approximations of overlapping and indistinct energy systems. So don't be afraid to modify them for each athlete as you learn more about that athlete and as their abilities progress. Now that we've briefly reviewed thresholds and zones, we can move on to setting and managing athlete zones and training peaks.